Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here tonight. I was a long flight from the West Coast, but I'm so delighted to be back here, see the foliage, and see this beautiful campus. I was able to take a short walk, and it's a really beautiful place, and certainly delighted to be here tonight. I want to mention, starting from the title of my presentation, that when I started the graduate school, nobody was talking about financial literacy, nobody was talking about personal finance. And I hope by the time I've finished my lecture today that I've convinced at least some of you, in particular the student, that personal finance belongs in your campus. In fact, belongs in every campus. And I hope that if you don't have a course in personal finance, that you will demand one here, because I actually think financial literacy and personal finance are essential skills that every young people need in order to thrive in today's society. And this is, in two words, more or less the message of my paper, of my presentation. But to do so and to kind of explain why this is so important, I'm going to take you to a tour of 25 years of research. So it's a little bit long, it's a little bit data-oriented, it's a little bit boring, but so, let's go together with me in kind of telling you why financial literacy is important now, why we were able to open this field, and I'll tell you why we call it a field, because there is a Journal of Economic Literature code about financial literacy. It is G53, okay? So, we are officially, in a sense, with a new field, and, if you were to study and start a PhD program today or so on, you would probably be studying financial literacy, and hopefully in your studies, you'll be able to take a course in personal finance as well. So as I've mentioned, what I would like to do today is start with measurement, because if we don't measure, we don't know what we are talking about. And the problem is, when I started to ask myself, but are people financially literate? And I'm asked this question because we are asked to make so many decisions. There was no data on financial literacy, so we had to design that data, we had to design that measurement. And in particular, I want to show you that not just financial literacy is relevant, but it matters for financial behavior. If you don't have that knowledge, it's very unlikely that you'll do well, in your financial decision. In my lifetime, I haven't met a single person, apart perhaps from Forrest Gump, which invested in stock, but not knowing anything about the stock market. And as you can see from a recent episode, people who thought that cryptos were a great place where to invest, perhaps, not so much. So that knowledge is really influential, not just for investing, but for many decisions that we make. And I want to use also some of what we have learned from that research to actually apply it, and in particular apply to something that's very close to us, which is applied to college, applied to what we do at the college campus, and also in many other places as well. And so that's why I'm also going to talk a lot about teaching, in addition to research on financial literacy. And to motivate the importance of this topic, we don't need to go very far than looking at college students. And I want you to meet my student, Charlinda. She was a student in my course at GW several years ago, and 4 or 5 years after she took this course, she wrote me this long letter saying that because she took the course, she was able to pay off her student loans, and she told me how she did it and how important that was. And we have kept in touch a lot. In fact, after I started teaching personal finance rather than money and banking or macro, I got all of these letters from the students. They didn't write to me when I was teaching money and banking. Not that money and banking is not important, but perhaps it's not as memorable, or perhaps it doesn't affect your life as much as some of these courses, in a sense. But I'm going to I talk a lot about her because there are many things in these photos that are in this picture that are very related to the research. The fact that young are the people that have very low financial literacy, are the people that need it the most. And I'm going to talk about gender differences in financial literacy. Being an Italian woman, that's something that is very dear to my heart and to my culture. And so I want to tell you what the data, for example, says about this a lot. And I'm going to come back to Cerlinda at the end of the presentation as well. So just to say, why is this important? Because the decision that you are going to make start very early. In fact, you have already made a very fundamental decision. You are investing in education, and you have already decided about how to finance that education. And so, financial decisions now with respect to the past happen earlier and earlier. And as soon as you are going to start your job, you are going to decide how to invest in your 401k, where to invest. Your company is going to give you an offer that includes many financial decisions. And yeah, you actually have to evaluate offer depending also on the packages they give you on all these benefits. These are very complex financial decisions. We face very complex financial instruments. Right? In the past, we didn't have, for example, access to financial instruments like cryptos, and now we have, buy now, pay later. Click this button, get a mortgage. Right? Fintech allows us to make financial transactions that weren't possible in the past. Right? So these decisions are very important and are one of the reasons why we need that financial knowledge. So I want for a moment for you to think about all of the decisions that somebody has to do today, starting from your high school, where you have to decide where to go to college, how to finance that education, to all of these other decisions, right? Do you invest in cryptos? Do you, which type of mortgage, which type of pension are you going to take? Should you invest in your 401k? How do you pay off your credit card? So think of that, and I'm going to show you in a moment, but how financially literate are we now that we are requested to basically save for our future, right? Social Security, people feel like it's not going to be there. Of course it's going to be there. It's a very important institution, but it's going to be much reduced, and for most of you who have a college degree, doesn't replace a lot of your income. So you're also in charge for your financial security. And because you have a chance to live into 100, right, that's a very, very long life and also potentially a very long retirement. Okay? So if there is one thing that, there are two numbers I would like you to remember potentially from this presentation, is 3 1/3. So we are talking a lot about basically this number. And the first one is a good number. I'm basically going to show you that actually, and surprisingly, we can measure financial literacy just with 3 questions. So there is a little bit of an accident in history, how we were able to measure financial literacy with 3 questions, but you can do that, and in fact, I'm going to quiz you on that. So we can also measure your financial literacy. I don't need to know, because I already know, actually, given the statistics, but then you can test your own knowledge. But in fact, you don't need, a long number of questions. Just with 3, we have a pretty good sense of what is the financial literacy in the population. And 1/3 is unfortunately the number of people in the US who are financially literate. And this is a very striking number in my view. And the main message that I'm going to say in advance is that the level of financial knowledge is just too low. With respect to the type of decisions that we have to make. And as I've mentioned, and as I will show, if you don't have that knowledge, you're not going to do well. Ignorance in finance is not bliss. It's good not to know when you go to the dentist, how painful that will be. But apart from that, ignorance in this type of concept doesn't help you. And in fact, it's going to leave you behind, or is going to make you more likely to make mistakes. And in finance, mistakes tend to be costly. Okay? So I'm going to mention some of these things and document some of these things from the data as well. So starting from the first number, I'm going to tell you that back in 2000, and that's why I'm so excited to be here, I was able to meet at a dinner at one of these conferences where economists go. One of the professors, not too far away from here at the Wharton School, her name is Olivia Mitchell, and she's an expert on pension. So I sat close to her, and we started discussing how much pensions are different today, and that people are in charge of those decisions, which are so complex, right? So it's so difficult to decide how much you have to save for retirement. That's a super complex decision. And so I was discussing with her that, we don't know how much people know about, this fundamental concept at the basis of financial decision making. And, there was no data for that. And so I was lamenting the fact that there was no data. So the next day she calls me up and said, well, I have the possibility to add questions to this national survey. I am part of the research committee. It's called the Health and Retirement Study. And so we have a possibility to design a module, an experimental module, and we could measure financial literacy. And so we were very excited to do so. And then when we asked the people, how many questions can we add? They told us 3. It says, what do you mean 3? It's like, we need 20. In fact, actually, we need 28. It's like, no, you have 3. It's like, oh, God, how can we measure financial literacy? So we had to do so with just 3 questions. And I'm telling you this because then, faced with that constraint, we had to think so hard about what to ask, right? How can you measure financial literacy with just 3 questions? So we decided to go with the most fundamental and the most general and the most universal concepts. And for some of you econ students, let me at least ask to raise your hands if you are an econ student. Yeah, my God, so many, it's so exciting. So we asked things like interest compounding, inflation, and risk diversification, which I'm sure are terms that are, familiar to you. But, here we are asking this question, of course, to the general population. So I'm going now to take you through some of these questions. So you'll see what we are asking, okay? So, and the reason why these questions are so important, just the wording per se, is kind of to give you a sense of what we are really going for. We are going for the basics, right? So we are measuring very basic knowledge, right? If you look at the first question where we ask basic people to do a 2% calculation in the context of interest rate, right? Can you do a 2% calculation in the context of interest rate? And as you can see also, just to give you a little bit of a methodology of the question, we don't ask people to do this complex calculation in their head. We do a multiple choice question where we also can say, you can say do not know, refuse to answer. So for people who think that, I don't want to guess and you shouldn't guess, you can see what the question is. I assume that all of you can do a 2% calculation and that's not very complex, right? Would you say this is a complex question? No. Okay, I see people shaking their head. Okay, good. So the second question is about inflation. Why do we talk about inflation? By the way, in 2000, if you remember, inflation was 2%, right? 2% inflation over 30 years actually eats 25% of your wealth, okay? So even a 2% inflation is important. And the fact that prices increase over time is very important for your financial decision. More or less, I can tell you, if you don't invest your wealth to keep up with inflation, you are becoming poorer over time. So inflation is very fundamental, and so we ask this question. And by the way, note that this question is joint knowledge of what inflation is. We don't explain it. We use the word inflation. and understanding the fact that, if I give you an inflation rate which is higher than the interest rate you get on your wealth, are you getting poorer or richer? Okay? So here is the question. You can measure your knowledge. Okay? I'm not going to ask that, but was this question difficult? How many people think it was difficult? Oh, people don't. Okay. Well, yeah, you're cheating a bit. Anyway, okay, let me turn to the third question. And this was a question about risk diversification. Why? This is important. All of our life is about managing risk, right? There is risk everywhere. And of course, we are looking at, in particular, risk diversification in the financial context, right? So the question here is, do people know that, what is the riskier strategy, a stock or a stock mutual fund? This question is another joint knowledge of knowing the language of finance and understanding the difference, or understanding what is a riskier strategy, of one stock versus a stock mutual fund. Okay? This was meant to be a difficult question. Do you think it was difficult? Raise your hand if you think it was difficult. You're cheating a little bit. Anyway, okay, good. But I'm glad that overall this, was not super difficult. As you can see, and I want to leave the question there for a moment, these are fundamental concepts, right? I mean, these are at the basis of almost every decision. Knowing about interest rate, knowing about inflation, knowing about risk is part of all of our financial decisions, okay? So let me now turn to the data. And what I'm going to tell you is indeed, overall, the level of knowledge about this topic is super low, okay? Even though we are testing, again, we are not testing whether people know the Black-Scholes formula on how to price convertible bonds. Even though we ask them to do a 2% calculation, we will see that there is this extremely low level of knowledge, and let me document that. And I'm going to take you also to a tour of the world so that you understand what are the similarities here and why are this question, in fact, really hard for most of the population around the world. Okay? So here is what we can say about the US population when faced with these questions. And this actually was a phone interview where, again, people had the possibility to kind of listen to the question and reflect on them and so on, okay? And what you can see clearly is that, when you look at, for example, the interest rate, a good one in 5 Americans cannot do a 2% calculation, and, more than 1 in 10 says, I do not know the answer to this question. Right? When we look at inflation, which is so fundamental, again, 1 in 5, is incorrect about the inflation, and a good 14% kind of doesn't know the answer to this question. As you can see, the refuse to answer are very few, so at a certain point we are not even looking at them. But what you see now, and where the answer really changes, is in the risk diversification, right? Where now 1/3 of the people say, I do not know. Right? So people don't even want to venture, in a sense, guessing this answer, right? So people really do not know. Often what they don't know is they don't know what a stock or a stock mutual fund is, and I don't know what's the riskier between these two, okay? So let me now turn to Canada, right? Here is another country, very close to us, probably a different kind of education system and so on. And as you can see here, there are actually striking similarity there as well. Canada does a little bit better maybe in the interest rate, does similarly in terms of inflation, right? Yet again, there is a good proportion of the population who don't know this. But when it comes to the risk diversification, boom, right? 1/3 of the people say, I do not know the answer to these questions. Right? And when we look, by the way, each of the question itself, right, doesn't have high percentages, but when we look at all of them together, For the US, it was just less than 1/3, right? For Canada, it's less than half of the population is not financially literate. Again, we are looking at the ABC of financial literacy, right? So let's actually go to Europe now, and because some of your professors here are from Germany, let me consider Germany. I've considered Germany because in Italy there is a rivalry with Germany. So, here we go. So this is a country with a kind of a strong education system, a very, very low. They were very, very kind of strong about inflation. They wanted the inflation to be, in a sense, very low. And if you look at the European Central Bank, it adopted, in a sense, the policy of monetary policy of the Bundesbank, right? And what you see here is that they can do this calculation better. They know more about inflation. They are probably more concerned about inflation. But look at this. Yet again, 1/3 doesn't know about the risk diversification, right? So yet again, these concepts are not simple, and risk is the one that is considered the most difficult. And when we look at how many people, again, are financially literate in Germany as well, is about half are not financially literate, right? And yet again, we are looking at the ABC, knowledge that we assume everybody has, right? Let me go now kind of fast and to tell you that because there were only 3 questions, we were able to add this question more or less now in most countries around the world. And it's because it was only 3. And because there were 3, then it was easy to add these questions everywhere. So what we thought was a disadvantage turned out to be a big advantage. And so recently, we have now done this question in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, and back to the US, because we wanted to know, so how much the US knows now we are also experiencing inflation, right? Is financial literacy doing better? So let me tell you about the most recent data about the US, and let's look in particular at inflation. If any, knowledge is not improving. If any, is actually doing even a little worse, right? And if you look at the knowledge of inflation, this is actually where we see a very low level of knowledge of inflation. This is data for 2021, right? So, of course, we didn't have a long experience or time of experience, but definitely this knowledge should not be taken for granted, even in a country with well-developed financial markets. In fact, even in the country with the most developed financial market. You don't learn financial literacy just by watching the world around you. So fast forward, I wanted to show you that not just financial literacy is low, but it's in particularly low among some groups. Who are those groups? Who is your guess? Who would like to guess? Who are the group who know the least? Yes? Minority. In fact, this is actually one of the groups I have not put up because we have done less research, but this is probably one of the most disadvantaged groups. So we have done actually a lot of kind of analysis on this, but I'll talk less about this, but I'm very glad you actually have mentioned them. And this is, disproportionately so, okay? Another group, which has very low knowledge. And remember, this is low below the 1/3, right? Who could be that group? Women? Yes. Yes. I already have mentioned this a little bit with Charlinda, right? There is a big gender gap. By the way, it's true around the world. All of the countries I've covered here, there is a gender difference. How about that? Another group, which have low financial literacy. You, young people, okay? If you look at this statistic, this is to me the most sad and difficult statistic, right? If you look at the population in the US, 18% on the people 18 and 24, 11% are financially literate, right? We ask people to take up student loan. The average student loan today is $32,000. At Stanford, the 1-year tuition plus room and board is $80,000 this year. So, we ask people to take up, in a sense, and make this financial decision. Their financial literacy is basically absent. And interestingly, as you can see here, it's not that people who have made many financial decisions are very financially literate, right? So people make decisions with very little financial knowledge, even close to retirement, they are not, in a sense, really financially literate when we ask this type of very simple questions. And related to kind of your point or the point you were making, there is a very strong correlation between education and income, okay? So because you are highly educated, you are more likely to have a higher level of financial literacy. Of course, you could do a 2% calculation. Of course, you could have a sense of inflation, right? But in fact, people which do not have a high school degree or do not have a college degree have even lower financial literacy. People with lower income have disproportionately lower financial literacy, and this is where a lot of the minority also are also listed, okay? So we have actually taken these statistics and tried to understand, but why? Why is financial literacy so distributed so differently? And there is also an economic incentive. I'm glad you are all econ students. So as you can imagine, some people have an incentive, in a sense, to be more financially literate, right? And some others do not, right? If you are, for example, often in a job that doesn't have an increase in income or an upward slope in a earning profile, you might actually not need to be financially literate, right? Because probably your pension will really take care of you. Perhaps you don't make as many of these complex financial decisions. So people who really need, in a sense, that knowledge are the ones who are probably most invested in financial knowledge. And this is, in fact, it does explain some of the differences that you see here, okay? However, not all of it. And so what we did more recently, we started collecting data, our own data, each year. So we could actually understand a little bit more what's happening, and we could understand a little bit more each year, choose a specific group and really see some of those facts that can be important. So we are now collecting data, measuring financial literacy with 28 questions. So, forget about the big three, now we have 28. We could actually look at basically all of the topics that should be part of a personal finance course. So we look at all the decisions that people make, and we make, in a sense, questions, 2 or 3 questions, yet again, related to all of those topics. So now I have a measure of the personal finance knowledge, basically the knowledge that you are required in order to make decisions about borrowing, saving, investing, insuring against risk, and so on. Okay? So let's now see how we are doing with respect to the much more complex knowledge. And of course, as you can imagine, some of these questions, could be tricky for somebody who really doesn't have, in a sense, any relationship with stocks. But here we are also looking at the day-to-day financial decisions, right? Consuming, right? Go-to sources of information, okay? So what's the level of financial literacy when we look at this type of questions? So now I have a quiz with 28 questions, okay? Well, what turns out is basically people get half of those questions. And I'm sure in Villanova too, if you only get half of the questions, you don't get a B, but you get an F, right? So in this test, basically, of financial knowledge, unfortunately, yet again, we see that people, even in the type of information, even in the type of decision that we make every day, in fact, when asked in a more rigorous way, people fail that test. And there are a big proportion, 25%, who don't even are able to answer basically 7 of these 28 questions, okay? So there is a good also proportion of people who actually know kind of very little, okay? How has this increased over time? Knowledge has not changed over time. It's not improving. In fact, it might even get worse over time, okay? And as you can see, that proportion of people at the bottom, if any, is increasing, right? So if we don't If you leave it to themselves, to the market forces, and so on, financial literacy doesn't get much better, okay? What are the topics that people know the most and the least? Okay, and you might not be surprised that the borrowing, which is really the largest action in a lot of the balance sheet, when I look at the balance sheet of young people in the US, disproportionately there is borrowing, right? And these are indeed the topic that people know the most, but the topic that are very important, in particular now that we are facing so much risk. So risk and insurance is what people know the least, and I knew that already by looking at the question I had designed before, right? These are the topics that people are actually knowing much less, right? So this data as well confirm these findings, okay? And so because we were doing this test over COVID, then we thought, well, people are now subject every day to information about percentages, probabilities, probability of getting the disease, right? So I actually asked the questions, but do people know probabilities, right? If we give the probability in this mathematical way, are people able to understand these probabilities? What do you think are the proportion of the people who can answer this question correctly? People cannot do a 2% calculation. How about the probability? Do they understand the probabilities? As you can imagine, the answer is no, right? In fact, only 28% are able to know, what are the higher chances here of getting a disease, right? And remember how we reported the information to people, right? So this is important because yet again, we are giving a lot of information, we are reporting them, right, in this most rigorous way, but in fact, if people don't have the financial knowledge, they are not really able to use this information at all, okay? So let me talk about one of the topics I'd mentioned. If you look at the difference between men and women, there is almost a 10 percentage point difference, okay? So women here are less financially literate, and it's true across countries, okay? Let's look at also the 8th topic. The fact is women in each of the topic, right, are less financially literate, in each of them, right? But what's happening? Why are women less financially literate? Is it because they are more wrong? Or is it because they are more likely to say, I do not know, okay? So what happened and what you can see clearly here is women are disproportionately more likely to say, I do not know the answer to this question, okay? And this is great if you think about that. Women do not know, and they know they do not know, right? So they are actually more likely to state what's the truth, potentially. But the problem is that lack of knowledge is in fact lack of confidence, right? And that lack of confidence, is it good or bad? It could be good in some part, but it should be such that it doesn't become fear, right? Because if it is lack of confidence and you don't really, you have some knowledge, but you're not really sure, then you might not act upon it. Let me go back to Charlinda, as I mentioned earlier, right? She was sitting in the front row, and often when I ask a question, she would never raise her hand. But then I said, Charlinda, do you know the answer to this question? And she would be right in answering the question. But because she was not sure 100%, she didn't raise her hand, right? And so, in other words, we need not just knowledge, but we need to consider that some knowledge is also lack of confidence. And so as we teach financial literacy, we also have to be conscious of that part of this knowledge is also increasing, in a sense, the confidence. And this is actually the new project that we have been doing. So what we did, we used the big tree, and we took away the do not know options and asked people to choose the answer. And guess what? Women were correct, and they knew the answer to this question. So the gender difference shrinks a lot when you actually don't give women the option to say do not know. And we were able also to measure what's the level of confidence in this data. So I can tell you that 1/3 of this gender gap is due to confidence. Okay? So please ask me a question about this at the end. Okay? So I can tell you more about it. Let me go a little bit faster now, because what I wanted to tell you is not only we are not improving, but also we are getting worse. Meaning that the people who are financially literate are people who were financially literate to start with. So are mostly male, are mostly people with good jobs, and are people exposed to financial education. So over time, we are becoming more unequal also in financial literacy. Okay? And this is why I think it's important also for university to take action and to provide more access to financial knowledge, in particular to people who would not have that type of knowledge and information. Okay? So why is it important? Does it matter? Okay? Let me show you, and this is where some of the picture didn't come up, but kind of this was supposed to show the line at the food bank in the US, and you can tell that different computers have different setup. But let me kind of go to the data to show you one important measure that we have took up in order to measure whether financial literacy matter. Okay? We wanted to measure financial fragility. So we are not looking at whether people invest in stock or in cryptos. We are asking whether people have the capacity to face a shock. And in fact, this is a kind of a questions measuring, do you have the confidence to come up, not even to have the resources, but to come up with $2,000, right? If an unexpected expenses come up, and this is $2,000 expense, right? So it's not a small shock, but it's not a large shock. It's not even the shutdown of the pandemic, right? Can people deal with this emergency? And we classify people being financially fragile if they couldn't come up with $2,000, okay? This is actually a measure of the balance sheet. It basically says whether, you have a lot of debt or basically you have little asset. So with one question only, I'm able to measure the state of your balance sheet, okay? And I wanted to show you one graph here, also with the paper we published in the Brookings paper of economic activity. So after the financial crisis of 2008, half of American would not have been able to face the shock of $2,000. This is how much America was hurting in 2008 and after the crisis of 2008. Right? We were extremely fragile. The other thing I wanted to show you, as the economy was doing better, the fragility decreased. But in 2020, this is January 2020, this is where the economy is booming. And this is almost the height of the stock market. Yet, only 1/3 of Americans would have been able to face a $2,000 shock. This is where the unemployment rate was 4%. People were working, the economy was booming, okay? We were doing so well, yet people couldn't face a shock, okay? This is just to tell you how important your finances are. It's not whether you have a high job or whether you have faced low unemployment. If you don't manage your finances well, right, you are actually not able to face a shock. And this can have huge consequences. This type of fragility affects also your long-term perspective, affect your financial anxiety, affect your financial well-being, right? And this is why it is so important, right? If you look at the relationship with financial literacy, it's a very obvious relationship, right? It's people which have low financial literacy which are disproportionately more likely to be financially fragile. So from simple decision like financial fragility, being able to face a shock, to big decision, investing in the stock market, managing your debt, all of those decisions, financial literacy matters and matters a lot, okay? I've done this in a simple kind of classification. You can also look at kind of model and regression, right? But this is really to show you, and let me actually turn to this point, that basically financial literacy affects behavior. It does matter, right? Being able to be financially literate gives you this additional opportunity to do well and to do better, okay? And this is why it's so important to have that basic knowledge, okay? Let me turn quickly now to, because of this, what do we do and what can we do? And what is also the role of universities, right? So I have 10 minutes. I'm going to try to run a little bit because I'm really interested in your question and figuring out what is it that you'd like to learn more. We can actually use this knowledge to inform policy, to create programs, to actually make sure that we give access to financial literacy to a large part of the population, okay? Let me tell you, for example, that given what we have learned, we need to do programs that are a lot more targeted, that are a lot more effective. So this is actually one of the programs we did ourselves. We designed short videos, 3 minutes, okay? I know that, you young people, don't want to get information in a classroom potentially or, use your smartphone. So we did very short video, 3 minutes. We use unemployed actors in Hollywood to actually write and be on the script, right? And because there is such a low level of financial literacy, we explain this concept in very simple ways, right? And these are the most important concepts that we explain. So we wanted to give the information. This is available at every time. It's in a story level. It's very simple. It's very enjoyable. And it's like people like you, right? It's really described by the same group. And what we found is that even a 3 minutes video has an effect. Even that little knowledge, that little story can help people be more financially literate. And not only it affected the young, but it affected the whole age group. And this is just to tell you, just given how low is the level of financial literacy, right? Intervention can have really important effect. Okay? And we need to find ways to really improve that low level of financial literacy. Okay? As you might know, many countries are doing national strategy for financial literacy. Who does know, for example, that there is a financial literacy month in the US? Did you know there is a financial literacy month in the US? And which month is that? We were clearly not effective in delivering that message, right? But there is a national strategy in the US for financial literacy. We are not doing enough, clearly, right? So November is Financial Literacy Month in Canada, and they are doing a lot of activity as well. October was Financial Literacy Month in Italy, and I was in charge, actually, of designing a national strategy for financial literacy in Italy. I chair the committee that designed this strategy in Italy, and we designed an entire month devoted to financial literacy, right? And this is, just to say that, you need to move even at that global level to do so. Let me turn to this, which is the most important part. I don't know why this picture are not coming up, but I think it might just be the incompatibility between the computer and so on. But I think the picture are not important, is the message is important. And the message I want to deliver to you is that we have started a personal finance course in GW in 2012, literally 10 years ago. Okay? And this is where I met Charlinda. And now we have actually a course in personal finance also at Stanford. Not only we did so, but we are actually starting a conference about teaching personal finance. So we brought together professors from the Ivy League to the community colleges, to actually learn about teaching personal finance and how can we better improve the teaching of personal finance. And this is actually an initiative which is between the business school, the econ department, and the CPER school, where we are now starting this financial freedom initiative. So what do we want to do? We want the student not just to take this course, and when we started this course, 362 students signed up. It was the most popular course at Stanford. But we would like the student to become ambassador of financial literacy. We would like the student to go in the community. In fact, a lot of the first generation students that started at Stanford told us they have become the financial advisor of their parents. Okay? So there is a big spillover effect of this course into the community. And I hope that we can actually start this course here as well at the university. Financial literacy, as I've mentioned, has now its own Journal of Economic Literature code. So it has become officially a field of study. And we have a journal dedicated to financial literacy as well. So we have a journal of financial literacy and well-being. Okay? So that's what it takes, in a sense, to be a field of study. We have done the research, we have done the measurement, we have the journal, but I think the most important part is really the financial literacy and the teaching, right? What can we do now? I really hope that this type of statistics happen at the national level and that we can collect data so we can check each year how financial literacy is doing. But in particular, I want to kind of go back to tell you how much my research has, for example, changed how I teach personal finance, okay? Just to go back to what I started with. You know, remember Charlinda, like I've learned a lot from the student, and I've learned, for example, that we need to build the language of finance, right? So I go in and I say, we are going to start in plain English and build the language of finance, because people, of course, I know they don't know the language and the jargon, right? I know that a lot of the female students do not come to class, or if they come to class, never raise their hands, okay? So now I motivate the class very differently, taking into consideration the motivation that the female versus the male student have about this course, okay? And then I asked the student, in particular in the first class, what they think this course is about, a course of personal finance is about. What do you think a course of personal finance is about? Who would like to venture? Yeah.
I'd say how to manage your money.
Yeah, it's how to manage your money. That's a very important part of the course, right? This is what you learn, right? But what is the objective of the course? What is this course about? I can tell you that a lot of my students, when I ask this question, they think it's a course about investing, right? They think it's a course about the stock market. And what I tell them at the end of the first lecture is that the course of personal finance is a happiness project. It's a course that helps you and give you the instrument so you can make the best decision for yourself, so you can live a financial secure life. And this is what I've learned from my research, is that the knowledge that we can have via financial literacy is very important for all of the decisions that we make. And that without that knowledge, we are not able to save for retirement. We are not able to actually provide for the shocks. We are not able to manage our debt well. And as a result, we might not live a secure life. And this is why I think financial literacy is so important. It's important for you. It's important for your community. It's important for society. And universities have a very, very important role to play to improve financial literacy. So I hope that you will help me in making sure that also at Villanova we will have a good course in personal finance and that you'll become important ambassador of financial literacy, perhaps in your family or in your own community. Thank you very much. Okay, I would say we have 15 minutes for questions, so I hope that there are questions. Who would like to ask? Any question? If you do not ask the question, we'll have to ask your professor to ask it, so I think it's better for you to ask it.
You have two microphones.
So as your time as a professor teaching personal finance, obviously from an outside perspective, from someone that has no experience in it, it can be really intimidating. So my question is, how as a professor have you learned to make that lesson intimidating for people, especially those illiterate?
Right. Oh, thank you. This is actually a great question. You know, there are many barriers to, I think, teaching a personal finance course and for students to take a personal finance course. One is exactly what you have said, right? People think this is very difficult, right? Second thing, they think is very, very boring. And third, they think, this is taboo, right? It's not a topic I'd like to discuss, right? Or, and I also think that they think it's ideological, right? We are going to talk about capitalistic market and how great they are and so on, right? And so that's why I think it's super important, when we describe like the syllabus. For example, the syllabus really explain that, first of all, there are no prerequisites, right? I'm going to keep the math to the minimum. And this is a course for everybody. And this is, for example, a message we were able to deliver very clearly at Stanford, because, for example, we had a lot of freshman students. We were teaching in the spring, a lot of freshman students actually sign up, right? But a lot of people had exactly this consideration, or what I can tell you is every student over 10 years, almost every single student who have taken this course over 10 years said in their teaching evaluation, every student should take this course, right? Not because it's a beautiful course, it's because it's extremely helpful, but they learn it at the end of the course, right? So the question is, how do we tell the student? And so we are advertising this a lot and kind of really, and also promising and delivering what we promise, that it is a simple course and that you can deliver this, in fact, in simple ways.
Great, thank you.
Quick question. You had a slide up about financial literacy percentages by age group. So do you have that tracked over time? So, for example, if say 28 group, they were more financially literate on a percentage basis than say the folks who were 18. Was that because they acquired knowledge over those 10 years?
Right. So,
and this is a follow-up. Okay. It was interesting that for the older folks who were over 75, the percent dropped, which kind of scared me. One of two things is happening. Either the folks who are financially literate are passing away at a faster rate,
right?
Or they're
right. That's right. Super important. So first of all, what you see, this is a simple cross section, right? So and you cannot argue. For example, looking at this data, you cannot infer that a young person today, right, will have the financial literacy of an older person there. So, I don't have, we don't have longitudinal data. Even the data we have collected now is a series of cross-section. So we could group and see how the financial literacy is evolving. And what we see, basically, is there is very little learning over the life cycle. So like the young, of course, the young today do not know because they don't have any experience. They don't have any knowledge, right? The reality is, I think, experience is not a great teacher, meaning we don't see an enormous learning, given that these are three very simple questions, right? And I think the reason there is very little learning is because many financial decisions you don't make many times. It's not that you buy a lot of cars or you retire many times, right? Or so, it's different than buying milks, right? You might, and if you are a day trader, you probably have learned even less. In that sense, I think, experience might not be the best way to learn. You mentioned the older population. So what happens there, right? We think is a combination of generation effect, meaning these people didn't have, probably many complex decisions to make in the past, and in many ways they were a lucky generation, meaning they lived their life with pension guaranteed by their employer. Inflation basically kind of, added their debt over their life cycle, and they didn't face many complex financial markets. No cryptos or no specific, even their mortgages were probably very simple. Probably there is also a cognitive decline, right? And that's actually what you see. So in another paper, we have looked at, but what people think they know, right? And how much do they know? And we wanted to compare these two. And we found what I assume you might all know, that almost everybody in the US think they are above the mean, right? And over everybody think that they are financially literate. And who are the people where is the biggest gap? Among men, and among the older population. The older population knows very little, think they know a lot, and the problem is they are the people who have their wealth. And so it's no surprise that the scams go after the older population. They are an ideal target, right? And this is why I think we really need also regulation protection for people which are particularly vulnerable. As you know, in the US now, there are regulators just devoted to consumer, and I think they are much needed. When people have this low level of financial literacy, you can make a lot of mistakes, right? So we need some safeguard, in a sense, to help people about these decisions.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful lecture. I have two questions. One is, can you comment more on that gender differences, just due to confidence, you have time? And the second question is that given how vulnerable, especially the low-educated individuals are to financial literacy, and how low the education achievement is in the US, have you guys considered to expand the education opportunity to high schools? Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, these are two great questions. So this gender difference, thank you for this question, is very, very important. So we actually have done a global survey, and I can tell you there is a gender difference around the world. And the reason why I know it's gender is that women around the world are disproportionately more likely to say, I do not know, right? So it's literally a gender. Like, women, when they don't know something, like they admit it, right? And so that actually could be a good feature. In finance, it might go both ways. And so what we find in our data is that if you lack that confidence, unfortunately, you are less likely to act, right? And so the paper I've shown you there actually shows that women, which have lower financial literacy and lower confidence, are much less likely to invest in the stock market. So by the way, I did a picture that fortunately showed up of the fearless girl. So I have to say I'm probably the only economist who had an economic model about the fearless girl, about the statue. But that statue makes a lot of sense, actually, right? We need to provide that confidence to women. We need to remind women, in a sense, to take care of their finances. And I know, if I sit, even today I was kind of sitting closer to a person at the airport, and it was this older woman and says, I work on finance, I study finance, And she said, oh, I don't know anything about finance. And I wanted to say, I know, right? But it's not true. And so the women is the first thing they say, it's like, this is not what you should say, and particularly for the women here. Finance is part of your life, take action, empower yourself to have this knowledge because it's incredibly important. And you can't rely on someone else making this decision for you. The divorce rate in the US is 50%, women live longer than men. And by the way, if you don't negotiate your salary, you are going to be paid less than men. And over your lifetime, you're going to earn $1 million less. So learn your bargaining because it really, really matters. And in our personal finance class, we have a lecture about bargaining because the data is very clear. If you don't bargain, you are paid less, and women do not ask. So do ask. Your other point is, I started with the college, right? But should we start off college? Clearly not, right? We should start not only in high school, we should start in the elementary school. I actually think financial literacy now is a basic skill, like reading and writing. You have to learn this little by little. You have also become familiar with this topic. Right? I didn't talk a lot about this, but in one of the studies, we look at who is the proportion of people who are financially literate. They are disproportionately white male from college-educated family, right? We have a data set where we can connect the knowledge that 23 to 28 years old have to when they were growing up, 10 years earlier. And we have information about them, this is a longitudinal panel, about their characteristic as teenager and their characteristic of their parents. So the financial literacy of 23 to 28 years old can be linked to the wealth of the parents when these people were growing up. And in particular, if they had retirement saving and stocks. A long story to tell you that people learn personal finance at the dinner table. But not everybody has this option, and that's why we need to provide it in the school, in elementary school, in college, and beyond. Otherwise, people who do not have this knowledge are left behind.
Maybe as the organizer, I'll go ahead and take the liberty of asking the very last question. And again, I would rather have the students ask the question because they're not seeing, and I'll go ahead and ask the last question for the evening, which is how do you think about the interaction between personal finance and behavioral economics, in particular behavioral biases? Like over the last 3 years, I see things like after pay, so you can break out payments of $50 into 4 payments of $12.50, and that's got to make things complicated in the long run for individuals who are not financially sophisticated. So could you comment either about the growth of these kinds of programs or more generally about the interaction between financial literacy and behavioral biases and behavioral economics?
Yeah, this is actually very important. What we have learned, and this is mostly from psychology, right, is that people suffer from a variety of biases. And they are very prevalent, right? I mean, people tend to be overconfident. People think in nominal term, and so on. And so, we have also to be careful in, explaining to them these biases, right? And take actually that psychology into consideration as well. So I try to incorporate as much psychology and as much behavioral economics and make, people aware, by the way, of those biases. I must say, though, that those biases are much stronger and much more prevalent in people who do not know. So a personal finance course, to tell you the truth, is a way for you not to have those biases. Because you have those biases because you are, in a sense, improvising in kind of financial decision using common sense. Common sense in finance is actually doesn't bring you very far. And you might be suffering from actually some of those biases. But one of the things I've really learned from behavioral economics is, first of all, how important it is to motivate, a course, how important it is to frame a question better. and also how important it is to take many of these characteristics, including like some of these psychological characteristics into consideration. It is very important, in particular, when we design a program, right? I mean, fortunately, and the reason why I want to start with university here, we can bring people in a classroom, and we can really give you this type of rigorous program. In many other cases, when you look at the adult population, we are not able to do that, right? So we have then, to use everything, every power we have to kind of, make sure that we can provide that information. And I think, behavioral economics have told us, well, use perhaps, really critical moment, use nudges so that, you are also pushing behavior already in the right directions, right? Really maybe frame questions differently so they are easier for people to understand. But I think at the college level, we have the luxury to bringing you in the classroom and giving you this very rigorous kind of information, so you don't have to rely on common sense, which is not very helpful. You don't have to improvise, and you have a chance of really doing well and being happy in your life. It's a big promise, but I promise you it's true.
Thank you.